So first of all, thank you very much for the friendly introduction and for the invitation to take part in this exciting workshop. I'm very, very happy and glad to be back in the realm of the VWI, which was a very important time for me. And I tried to prepare some thoughts about Hannah Arendt's discussion on human rights, which I felt, to borrow this great phrase Agnes Heller used yesterday, a crucial example of the way in which Arendt expressed time in concepts. In 1946, Hermann Broch, the Austrian-born writer who had fled after the Anschluss and made it to the United States in 1938, circulated a paper among his friends and colleagues entitled Considerations on the Utopia of an International Bill of Rights and Responsibilities. Here, he drafted concrete propositions for the Human Rights Commission of the newly founded United Nations, headed by Anne Eleanor Roosevelt, which was busy preparing the later ratified Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Broch's paper also reached Hannah Arendt, who had closely befriended him that same year. In September 1946, she sent her first manuscript about human rights issues to him, stating that his thoughts inspired her to write down her own ideas on the topic. In the following letters and publications, we learn how the discussion about the best way to affirm and adopt a universally recognized human rights regime was existential to both thinkers in the aftermath of the Holocaust. A pressing need to rethink and reevaluate the premises of humanity, or as Broch put it, the necessity to humanize the world anew, to secure peace and mutual recognition, was a crucial motor for what was perceived as a solution for these problems, a global enforcement of human rights. Especially Jewish intellectuals at the time, most prominently René Cassin, the French Jewish jurist who was a leading figure in the drafting commission, discussed the complex problems of securing human rights as a way to overcome the horrors of the Nazi regime in Europe and prevent their repetition. Hannah Arendt now is recognized for a substantial contribution to the debate on human rights from a perspective of legal philosophy. After the collective Jewish experience of a total deprivation of rights in Nazi Europe, the question of securing and stabilizing rights, of re-establishing a legal realm for those who had been thrown out of it, was driving her thinking. Arendt clearly saw that in order to create a more humane world, the sphere of rights was a, if not the, profound key. What is less known is that her considerations were also an expression of the respective debates between her and Broch, and a recollection of their negotiations seems to help us understand the importance of these issues. Therefore, I will resume and link both of their positions to place the question about human rights within Hannah Arendt's reconfiguration of thinking and responsibility after the Holocaust. As is widely known, she obviously affirmed the Declaration of Human Rights as a collective effort to overcome war and hatred, but had a skeptical perspective on its effectiveness. Therefore, she offered an insightful view on problems of mutual recognition and plurality in the world, which I think are still very relevant today. The two iconic events of the time that built the ground for Arendt's and Broch's deliberations were the Nuremberg trials and the Declaration of Universal Human Rights of the UN. The trials, in Hannah Arendt's perspective, were revolutionary in their recognition of an international responsibility that bases on the idea of humanity. The newly established prosecution of crimes against humanity, which was defined in the Charter of the International Military Tribunal, for Arendt constituted the first steps towards an international law which might transcend the principle of sovereign nation-states and take the idea of a united humanity as a starting point. This idea obviously also guided the UN Declaration of Human Rights. Acknowledging its goodwill, both Arendt and Broch noted a conspicuous lack of reality within the concept. They recognized two fundamental problems. On the one hand, the problem of sovereignty, on the other, the problem of applicability. Both intellectuals tackled these questions from mutual ground, but answered them differently, with Broch working towards pragmatic political solutions that aimed at actual implementation, and Arendt taking a more abstract position, trying to approach the concepts as such. They agreed that the declaration did not sufficiently solve the problem of enforcement arising from what was called the tension between a universally approved duty to humanity, die Humanitätspflicht, and the recognition of particular national rights and sovereign decisions. Recognizing the latter undermined any universal approach because it meant to submit to the principle of political non-intervention. And this principle for both seemed unacceptable after what happened in Nazi Europe. They clearly addressed the flaws of the newly established human rights agenda, which to them stayed on the level of mere proclamation. It offered no solid possibility of sanctioning violations, and its global acceptance was by no means guaranteed. The question of sovereignty preoccupied Arendt in her article on human rights of 1949, which was published in German and English. Here she highlighted the fact that certain political realities, i.e. the reality of the extermination camps, where, and I quote, people were persecuted not because of what they had done or thought, but because of what they unchangeably were, born into the wrong kind of race, needed to be answered with actions disregarding sovereign rules. She made unmistakably clear that the unrestricted recognition of sovereignty, the system on which the community of nations was still built upon after the war and is still to this day, actually foils the idea of a universal human rights regime because the adherents cannot be controlled. The problem of sovereignty also led to the second problem of the declaration Arendt put to the forefront. She found that the reality of millions of stateless people, which the political upheavals of the 20th century had produced, constitute the best litmus test for the universal validity of human rights. As it seemed to her, this group, which generated the necessity of a fundamental reformulation of human rights, benefited the least from them. Consequently, Arendt offered in her article, as well as in her path-breaking chapter, The Perplexities of the Rights of Man in the Origins of Totalitarianism, a phenomenological approach to what statelessness actually means and how it challenged modern notions of the legal and the political. She used the figure of the stateless refugee to point to the fact that the loss of citizenship equals the loss of a distinct place in the world. Without the participation in the legal sphere, human beings are deprived of the essential feature of belonging to humanity in general. Human rights can only be claimed and secured in national or social communities. They plainly don't exist for people outside these realms. And this fact is what Arendt called the perplexity of human rights. The declaration that, based on the principles formulated first in the American and French revolutions in the 18th century and that were reinstated by the UN, only sufficiently works for members of states. Only as citizens, human beings can act politically, judge, and articulate opinions, notions that, as we heard already many times, Arendt categorizes as essential categories for the human nature. It is against this background that Arendt understood statelessness, a condition she obviously knew from her own biographical experience, as one negative signum of the 20th century and called for new perspectives on international law. And I quote her, "The calamity of the rightless is not that they are deprived of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or of equality before the law and freedom of opinion, formulas which were designed to solve problems within given communities, but that they no longer belong to any community whatsoever." This awareness led her to the famous conclusion that the only right humans have to have universally guaranteed is the right to be part of a political entity, the right to citizenship. So the main demand Arendt brought forward in her critique of the UN Declaration was the demand for the right to have rights, to guarantee every individual to take part in the world by belonging to a political national entity. Clearly, the specific demand was equally hard to enforce as the proclaimed universal human rights in general. And Arendt gave only small hints about the way she would imagine a practical realization of her claim. Rather, we have to understand her intervention as an element of her intended reevaluation of modern traditions of thought and concepts of historical explanation, which she felt had become insufficient in the confrontation with the monstrous reality of the Holocaust. We just heard about it. The basic ideas of human civilization were at stake. A common consensus that guided modern civilization even in war times, and expectations of progress and future. Actually, the entire apparatus of understanding and judging exploded when the mechanical fabrication of corpses, to quote Hannah Arendt herself, became a certainty. The breaking down of all standards made Arendt skeptical about the possibilities of a revitalization of such concepts as modern human rights. What is meant by human and what is meant by rights had to be discussed anew in a world where human beings had been made superfluous and a world of systematically organized death had been installed. In our writings and discussions with Bloch, we find one notion that seems sometimes overlooked, but that was promoted by both thinkers, and there's reason to believe that this was a mutual idea, to overcome some of the problems described. And that is the concept of human dignity. Hermann Bloch claimed already in 1946 that an international Bill of Rights may only come into practice, become reality, if a third principle, human dignity, was used to bridge the gap between the universal and the particular. He proposed that on the national level, laws to protect human dignity should be enforced. These laws should be meant to protect the recognition of equality and freedom of all citizens and should be implemented together with an international bill of responsibility as a penal code. Moreover, he claimed that an international court of justice be installed to sanction violations. Bloch not only designed measures to implement this law and drafted its paragraphs already, he also called for a global initiative in education, guiding people towards peaceful coexistence. This idea was obviously inspired by American re-education programs in Germany. His visionary, rather utopian goals needed another 50 years before elements came into practice. Especially the International Criminal Court, which conducts lawsuits against violation of human rights by individuals as well as groups or states, was only established in the late 1990s. Arendt looked at the problem from a much more epistemological angle, but also she was preoccupied with the question of human dignity. She explained that the totalitarian regimes had aimed at the transformation of human nature itself and had therefore destroyed, I quote, every trace of what we commonly call human dignity. For respect for human dignity implies the recognition of my fellow man or our fellow nations as subjects, as builders of a world of co-builders of a common world. So she agreed with Bloch that a reframing of the concept of human dignity might help in the difficult way to support a human rights regime. She offers a slight hint to that in the Origins when she stated, I quote again, "Anti-Semitism, imperialism, totalitarianism, one after the other, one more brutally than the other, have demonstrated that human dignity needs a new guarantee which can be found only in a new political principle, in a new law on earth, whose validity this time must comprehend the whole of humanity, while its powers must remain strictly limited, rooted in and controlled by newly defined territorial entities." She does not explain how such a law should look like or how she imagined these newly defined territorial entities. But the idea to implement a national, if you will, law that protects human dignity as a foundation for the enforcement of human rights, just as Bloch had it, appears here too. Arendt is convinced that conventional justifications of human rights stemming from either a natural law perspective, meaning human rights is something inherently in the sense of naturally belonging to the essence of human beings, or a historical perspective, human rights is born from specifically historical, social, cultural situations, are not valid, or more precisely obsolete, after the Holocaust, which brought to surface that we cannot assume any standards of human interaction as given. Arendt's claim for a new reconstruction of human dignity entails important implications for human coexistence altogether. Humanity, in her proposition, replaces nature and history as rational or normative status for human rights. With the help of the notion of human dignity, Arendt points to some of her most important convictions. It directly connects to her vision of plurality and reciprocity. Her profound belief that, I quote, "men in the plural inhabit the earth," and that this fact entails to not only accept and recognize difference as inherent part of the human condition, and that this fact entails not only to accept but also to recognize difference as inherent part of the human condition. Upon revision, this means that every attack on any group of humans is an attack on human plurality and therefore on the essence of humanity in general. Translated into the sphere of human rights, this means that a non-recognition of dignity and the existential right of the other always amounts to a violation of one's own dignity and place in the shared world. To sum up this little tour de force through Hannah Arendt's thinking about human rights, I want to underline a few points that seem crucial for her understanding or seem important for our discussion on traditions of human and social visions that are still valid today. First, what is important to recognize, I think, is that our approach to the question of human rights is based on the conviction that, I quote, "the originality of totalitarianism is horrible, not because some new idea came in the world, but because its very actions constitute a break with all our tradition. They have clearly exploded our categories of political thought and our standards of moral judgment." This insight forced her to find new ways of understanding and comprehension, merely through a close confrontation with the events and their impact. Quote again, "Without understanding, we would never be able to take our bearings in the world. It is the only inner compass we have. If we want to be at home on this earth, even at the price of being at home in this century, we must try to take part in the interminable dialogue with the essence of totalitarianism." As far as I see it, also Arendt's discussion about human rights, their possibilities and aporia, has to be understood as a way to confront the reality of the Holocaust and the break with tradition, and to think the realm of politics and law anew. Second, the famous claim for the right to have rights has to be understood in a broad sense, I think. On the first level, it is clear that the demand for a right to belong, a right to citizenship, stems from her pioneering thoughts about the meaning of statelessness and the limitations of international law in protecting outer legal subjects. Her profound belief in the necessity of legal belonging for the human existence in the modern world is strikingly convincing to this day. On another level, and in this I follow very instructive perspectives of the political theorist Shaila Ben-Habib, we find that the right to have rights implies even more than that. It shows that the recognition of the rights of the individual other constitutes the common ground for being humans in a shared world. If we don't accept the fundamental right of the other because he or she is different from us, we deny our common humanity as such. It is this striking moment in Arendt's thinking about human rights which I think makes her deliberations very relevant for current debates on refugees, applicability of human rights, and the recently growing tendency to nationalization, national sovereignty, and increasing differentiations from the other. The basic quest of participation, freedom, and equality is still up for discussion. Even though the protection of human dignity is constitutional in a majority of nation states, the right to belong, to be integrated into a social context, which Arendt understood as the universal human right, is often challenged, especially in the context of refugee and asylum policies. The right to articulate views, represent interests, and be politically active is by no means ensured to all people, even if they come under the protection of international law nowadays. If we take Arendt seriously, and I'm positive we should, the processes of deprivation and exclusion currently executed on different groups of people will have impact on our own order on the Western social and political structure. Because as she put it very poignantly in The Origins, there's one basic assumption that should be clear. By violating the rights of one, you violate the rights of all. Thank you very much.
I want to thank Éva for inviting me to this workshop, and I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to talk about the politics of insanity and something about how Arendt fits into a particular constellation from 1961, which turns out to be a very strange year. So the title of my talk is Politics Gone Mad, Personal Responsibility in the Age of Ideology. I'd like to start by talking about Anders Breivik, and I'm sure you all know about Breivik. In 2011, he killed 77 people at a government building and a youth camp near Oslo, Norway. And after he did, a fascinated worldwide audience started combing through his 1,500-page manifesto, looking for clues of what motivated him. And what they found, among other things, were quotes from a leftist literary critic, a Nobel Prize-winning Holocaust survivor, Vlad the Impaler, and the Unabomber. So the question came up almost immediately, was Breivik political or was he merely insane? So this question became central to the legal case against him, and there was an initial psychiatric investigation, and the panel diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, and then a second evaluation was called that declared him sane, on the basis of which he was sentenced. So something happened between the first diagnosis and the second, and it's that something that I think speaks to this 1961 moment. So after the results of the first evaluation were announced, both the killer, Breivik, and the survivors and their families cried foul. In a very long letter addressed to the Norwegian media, Breivik, who was an unapologetic exponent of the extreme right, who greeted the court with a raised fist, wrote that to send a political activist to a mental hospital is more sadistic and evil than to kill him. It is a fate worse than death. Meanwhile, 56 of the victims whom Breivik had attacked and their families complained that if Breivik were declared sane, it would mean that he was not responsible for his crimes. And so in that moment, right and left, if you will, converged on the conviction that applying the insanity label would amount to a miscarriage of justice. And both sides were satisfied when the court ultimately declared Breivik sane. He was sentenced to 21 years in prison, and in the words of one survivor of the shootings, "I am relieved to see this verdict. The temptation for people to fob him off as a madman has gone." So how is it that the leftist victims and the right-wing perpetrator alike felt their interest to be served by the verdict of sanity, and how does it relate to the ideas put forward by Hannah Arendt and to the conundrum of politics in our time? And here I think this is where the 1961 moment is crucial. So in 1961, a lot of things happened. One of them was that a particular book was published by Thomas Szasz, and the title of the book was The Myth of Mental Illness, Foundations of a Theory of Personal Conduct. And Szasz was a psychiatrist and a psychoanalyst, and his book argued that mental illness in general was a myth, and Freudian psychoanalysis in particular was more religion than science. So particularly since this came from inside the profession on both counts, this was a very significant claim. So the essence of his argument was that psychiatry, unlike medicine, could demonstrate no physical reality to the diseases it identified and treated. The deceit whereby psychiatry and its practitioners masqueraded as scientists, he elaborated, was rooted in the language that they deployed. To speak of elevated blood pressure and hypertension, of sugar in the urine and diabetes, all as organic symptoms, and to place them in the same category as hysterical pains and paralyses is a misuse of language. It is nonsensical, and it creates a linguistic and epistemological muddle which no amount of psychosomatic research can clarify. So, 1961. The same year, the French historian Michel Foucault published Madness and Civilization, A History of Insanity in the Age of Reason in French. Foucault concluded in a kind of eerie harmony with the assertions of Szasz that language was at the heart of the partition of sanity from insanity, and by extension of the sane from the insane. In the words of Foucault, the language of psychiatry is a monologue of reason about madness. Another moment in 1961, Frantz Fanon traced the origins of the monologue to its imperial heart. Fanon was a practicing psychiatrist in Algeria whose critique of European colonialism focused on its psychological impact, which he saw as engendering an inferiority complex in the colonized black subject, who then seeks to imitate the oppressor. In his book, The Wretched of the Earth, which was published in French in 1961, Fanon approached the notion of psychiatry as social control after his own fashion, yet informed by Marxism and psychoanalytic theory. Since 1954, he wrote, we have drawn the attention of French and international psychiatrists in scientific works to the difficulty of curing a colonized subject correctly. In other words, making him thoroughly fit into a social environment of the colonial type. In other words, it was the colonial type that was sick. You cannot possibly cure someone into something that is already an illness. Fanon's work sought to demonstrate the impact of psychological pathologization on a massive scale. So it was just a few months later that Ken Kesey's novel One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was published. With it, the iconic nightmare who was Nurse Ratched, with her narcotic soft power that could transform the socially marginal into the terminally insane and literally lobotomized dissent, entered the popular imagination. And of course, in that fateful year of 1961, Hannah Arendt observed the proceedings of the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. And the famous subtitle of Arendt's report on the Eichmann trial was A Report on the Banality of Evil. And therewith she insisted firmly on the sanity of Eichmann, which was a necessary precondition of his criminal responsibility. Eichmann, though he had not killed anyone himself, had overseen the logistics behind a significant part of the Holocaust of European Jewry. And she writes, it would have been very comforting indeed to believe that Eichmann was a monster, a Bluebeard in the dock. The trouble with Eichmann was precisely that so many were like him, and that the many were neither perverted nor sadistic, that they were and still are terribly and terrifyingly normal. So Eichmann's normalcy was the surest indicator that a new type of criminal, in her view, had entered the world, one who commits his crimes under circumstances that make it well nigh impossible for him to know or feel that he is doing wrong. So with the Eichmann trial, the problem of the insanity defense, which is the insanity defense is rooted in the notion that it's predicated on the condition that someone be incapable of recognizing the difference between right and wrong. So the problem of the insanity defense was raised from the individual level to the level of society, and meaning that what happens when everyone tells you that mass killing is okay. So it created an unwieldy paradox. Since it is societal consensus regarding what is right and wrong that the insanity defense was meant to protect from rogue deviation, what is to be done when the societal consensus is that mass extermination is right? What made this new criminal so difficult to prosecute in court was that the prosecution had to set out the impossible basic premise that human beings be capable of telling right from wrong when all they have to guide them is their own judgment, which, moreover, happens to be completely at odds with what they must regard as the unanimous opinion as all of those around them, Arendt writes. So the confusion or inversion of standards of right and wrong under the Nazi regime meant that in Eichmann's case, quote, it was not his fanaticism, but his very conscience that prompted Eichmann to adopt his uncompromising attitude, unquote. He was a conscientious servant of the law and ideals of the time and place, insofar as intent to do wrong is necessary for the commission of a crime, and here she's citing the essence of the McNaughton rules, which are the basis for the insanity defense. Where this intent is absent, where, for whatever reasons, even reasons of moral insanity, the ability to distinguish between right and wrong is impaired, we feel that no crime has been committed. So I'm going to return to Arendt in a moment, but I would like to just point out the remarkably and spontaneous and simultaneous consensus that seems to have formed around the assessment of what I would call the inherent sickness of normality in 1961. That somehow normality itself is pathologized from a bunch of different positions, and this consensus emerges that normalcy is sickness. So, and this holds, interestingly, across the political spectrum. So Thomas Sass, for example, mounted an assault on the idea of mental illness from the right. He was quite a far right-wing libertarian who even defended the man who famously opposed desegregation in the South. And he suggested that suggesting that psychoanalysis had come to serve a left-wing agenda. He wrote, psychoanalysis diagnosed not only their patients, they also diagnosed the colleagues they disliked and the politicians who didn't share their left liberal progressive prejudices. They were all fanatical Democrats and considered Republicans either fascists or sick or both. Sass famously also weighed in when a bunch of psychiatrists diagnosed Barry Goldwater with some form of mental illness and said that, see, this is an example of what I meant when I said that the right is being pathologized. So the left, in his view, was pathologizing the right. But the syncretism of the ideas put forward in the myth of mental illness was already apparent. So very few people who read the myth of mental illness were right-wingers, and almost none of them even knew that Sass himself was a right-winger. So one of his critics pointed out that among Sass's earliest and most enthusiastic devotees were left-wing students keen to overthrow established dogma across the board, a group for which he by no means held a conspicuously high regard. And another critic has dubbed Sass a 60s kind of guy and an anti-establishment rebel. Meanwhile, in Arendt's theory of totalitarianism, which conflates Nazi Germany with Stalinist Soviet Union, regular politics of right and left syncretize into a regime type that fosters, even enforces, remoteness from reality and thoughtlessness of the sort she claimed Eichmann displayed. So as for Arendt's own politics, when in 1972 the American political scientist Hans Morgenthau asked her, "So what are you? Are you a conservative? Are you a liberal?" She replied, "You know, the left think that I'm conservative, and the conservatives sometimes think that I'm left, or I'm a maverick, or God knows what, and I must say I couldn't care less." And Foucault said in an interview with Paul Vane in 1978, "To judge by what the psychiatric authorities have had to say about me, the cohorts on the right who charge me with being against any form of power, those on the left who call me the last bulwark of the bourgeoisie, the worthy psychoanalyst who likened me to the Hitler of Mein Kampf, I have the impression of having had an irritative rather than anesthetic effect on a good many people." And also Fanon's anti-colonialism. Fanon was clearly came out of a Marxist tradition, but anti-colonialism itself has many syncretic elements that merge both right and left. So even when thinkers did not agree on what exactly was normal and where the power to establish the normal was, they seemed to agree that normal was sick. Arendt's banality of evil fits squarely into this trend. So the implications of this convergence, I think, are significant. For the pathologization of the normal renders dissent either meaningless or impossible. So what do I mean by this? If you assume that the normal is inherently sick, then soon nobody is going to claim to be normal. And that is precisely the environment that we're in. Everybody claims to be not part of the power normal. We live in an era when Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, Viktor Orban claim to be dissidents against the sickness of normality, to be the true seers who point out that the emperor has no clothes or that he's ill-clad, and whether they see the kind of reigning normalcy in political correctness, Western liberal hegemony, etc., or whether we look to the left with identity politics, which turns everyone into a kind of dissident against structures of hegemony, where normalcy is once again pathologized. You can see this consensus against normalcy, that normalcy is an inherent problem, and it's not just a problem, it's a sickness. So everyone therefore claims powerlessness, and no one wishes to occupy a position either of normalcy or of power. And even people who have immense amounts of power claim that they don't have it. And it's an interesting condition that I think stems from this consensus. So what now? What remains, and I think this is something that Arendt stressed in her writing on Eichmann, is something quite small, and that is criminal responsibility. That's really all that's left. And if you look at what changes between origins of totalitarianism and Eichmann in Jerusalem, and I'm not certainly the first to observe this, is that Eichmann in Jerusalem is a kind of correction of what of a central problem in Origins of Totalitarianism, which was that if totalitarianism was so totalizing that it was difficult to establish whether anyone under such a totalizing regime could be considered responsible for anything. Because if totalitarianism had that super force, which she ascribed to it, how could anyone within that system, someone like an Eichmann, be considered responsible for what they had done? It was the system, and when Eichmann says, I was just a cog in this great machine, he was sort of reiterating something that Arendt had suggested in Origins of Totalitarianism. So Eichmann in Jerusalem is a kind of rolling back or a revision of Origins of Totalitarianism, suggesting no, someone is still responsible, and specifically criminally responsible. So she wrote the fact that Eichmann merely never realized what he was doing should by no means exempt him from judgment. She decried the quite extraordinary confusion over elementary questions of morality created by the case of Eichmann and those like him, which had produced a reluctance everywhere to make judgments in terms of individual moral responsibility. And so I think if I were to predict, which is always a dangerous thing for historians to do, where this kind of normalcy vertigo will lead, I think one of the few possibilities is the trial, because the trial is the place where the norms of a society are tested and where they are discussed. Whereas this is no longer the case in governance. It doesn't happen at the level of government because no one declares or claims to have that power of normalcy or to occupy that position of normalcy. But in the case of courts, it still does and can happen. And the question is, can the courts bear this responsibility? It's a huge one. And so it goes back to the problem of what happens if the governing and societal consensus is other than the one that prevails in the structure of the court. So can the court alone return us to something like criminal responsibility? And is criminal responsibility enough? In the case of someone like Trump, for example, is it enough to serve as the kind of corrective that Arendt meant it to be? Or do we need something else as well? So with that, I'd like to close. Thanks very much.